Previously on the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. Sci-fi writer Toh EnJoe is brought aboard as the Godzilla anime series composer at the request of director Takahashi. The two creatives mull over many different scenarios, from the traditional to the bizarre, and while none of these stick, the creative team is closer now than ever to formulating the general outline of what we now know as Godzilla Singular Point. Singular Point is the latest Japanese entry of the Godzilla franchise, and it internationally debuted on Netflix this past summer. The video that you are about to watch will be exploring the very long journey it took to craft the narrative of this show. From its origins that predate Shin Godzilla, through the twists and turns it took the production staff to finally crack the general outline. You will also be hearing from several experts and enthusiasts alike. Kevin Derendorf, LeMay, Patrick Galvan, and Monstrosities livestream regular Rainey, who will be offering key insight and knowledge into the worlds of both anime and Godzilla productions. But before we do this, I have to ask, please subscribe to Monstrosities Tokusatsu Vlog. It is undeniably through the huge support of subscribers like you that allow us to continue to make videos like these. Now, with that said, please sit back and enjoy the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. Determining the setting of the Godzilla anime would allow the rest of the story's pieces to fall into place. Though nobody thought much of EnJoe's school scenario, the pitch that involved setting the story around a place of education where Godzilla acted as a yearly natural disaster, one wonders if that got the team thinking about back when they were kids, watching Kaiju Eiga unfold in theaters and on their home televisions. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug in global pop culture, so it's of little surprise that the creative team considered returning to the so-called Kaiju Golden Age. The Showa era of Japan refers to the 60-plus year reign of Emperor Hirohito from 1926 to 1989. In the world of Godzilla, it describes the 15 motion pictures that were created from 1954 to 1975. There was talk about giving the Godzilla anime a Showa-era feel, even going so far as possibly setting the story squarely in that time, as producer Yoshizawa revealed to CG World magazine.
The Showa era, this really, when it gets referred to, is usually talking about the reconstruction after World War II and the Japanese economic miracle when the recovery was coming about. This is when Japan was really fully embracing Western culture, and they were rising as a modern nation, and they were getting a lot of both economic and soft power around the world as the culture was really developing and flourishing. There's a lot of nostalgia for this period because it's a time when it seemed like anything was possible. And from a kaiju perspective, this is also when you had the big kaiju boom and then later the big superhero boom, where you got way more giant monster material and way more superhero material than you ever got again in Japan.
When the first Godzilla film was made in 1954, the Japanese film industry was in very good shape. Attendance for Japanese films domestically was very strong, and the domestic audience in Japan for Japanese films was very strong. Only 4 years after the first Godzilla, that was when Japan hit its all-time high in terms of attendance. So in 1958, more people went to go see movies in Japan than any other point in Japanese film history.
The Showa period is associated a lot with World War II, so it can be quite difficult to depict it sensitively. Most shows that I can think of that are set in that period, which were written more towards the modern day, they tend to have either a very serious vibe to them, or they have very big names behind them. That it's not just something anybody can really do, I find.
So I'm surprised they initially talked about setting this in the Showa era, because understanding the story for the characters was dependent on them using cell phones and text messages. But I will say, I kind of wish that Toho would actually do some animes set not just in the Showa era, but maybe in the Showa continuity. Maybe something light that doesn't upset fans, like nothing that's a great big departure from the mythos. Or maybe even better yet, what I really wish they do is find some of the better unproduced Godzillas, like Bride of Godzilla. I mean, the naked robot and all that would probably work well for anime. So I really wish Toho would look back on these unproduced scripts as templates for some new anime. I think that would be really cool.
I think that the Showa era would be an interesting period to revisit for a modern creator to take on. because there's all sorts of aspects that a production actually made in the Showa period without the benefit of hindsight might not recognize. And I think that there's interesting social aspects that could be explored there that wouldn't have necessarily been produced at the time, especially if you're talking about in the Showa era Godzilla stuff. Particularly, a lot of things were made for young children, and you can deal with headier issues. Some of the movies do, but there are all sorts of aspects, the Vietnam War, the student riots, things like that. These could be brought in as a backdrop for a Godzilla movie that can be interestingly done with the benefit of hindsight.
While Singular Point didn't end up in the Showa era, imagery and references remain throughout. This rings especially true in Episode 1's opening scenes of the Summer Festival, in which the filmmakers wanted a sort of Showa era feel, with the opening to feel somewhat like a Kadokawa film. The Kadokawa film feel is a reference to Dai Studios, the creators of Gamera and Daimajin, who merged with the Kadokawa Corporation in 2002 and later re-emerged as Kadokawa Daiei Pictures in 2004. While kaiju fans may best know them for the previously mentioned Gamera and Daimajin films, the film company also released a lot of Kaiki Eiga, or strange films, back during its peak years in the Showa era. An excellent explanation of what exactly Kaiki Eiga is comes from a dissertation by Michael E. Crandall titled Nightmares from the Past, Kaiki Eiga and the Dawn of Japanese Horror Cinema. These are domestic horror movies based on classic Edo period ghost stories, as well as imported pictures like Dracula and Frankenstein. They were a mainstay of commercial genre cinema in Japan from the silent era through the 1960s, and wielded an influence on the so-called J-horror pictures that achieved worldwide success at the turn of the millennium. Subsequently, Kaiki Eiga would be released during the hot summer months, when audiences needed chills to cool them down. For the first couple episodes we had in mind something kind of nostalgic, said Takahashi on the Episode 1 Blu-ray commentary. Like the kind of film they'd play in the Japanese summer holidays, kind of like horror or ghostly, that kind of thing. Though nostalgia was strong with the Showa era, there was little denying that setting the series in modern times, or the near equivalent of such, could also be a great decision. And the team began to think in that direction thanks to the most successful motion picture in Godzilla's contemporary history. If you recall, Shin Godzilla's massive success caused Toho to change course concerning the original Godzilla anime project, transforming the intended 13-episode television series into 3 theatrical films. Beyond this, Shin Godzilla had little creative influence on the Godzilla anime trilogy, a project that had years' worth of development behind it before Shin ever came along. The same cannot be said, however, for the then yet titled Godzilla Singular Point. Chronologically speaking, this production would technically be the first Japanese Godzilla project conceived in a post-Shin Godzilla world, and with Singular Point's production still in the embryonic stages, it would be impossible for Shin Godzilla to not somehow affect it. The influence of Shin Godzilla was huge, Toh EnJoe told Kaiju.net. The final 13 episodes of Singular Point would go on to feature many homages to Shin Godzilla. The show even repurposed abandoned or early ideas left over from Shin, such as the multiple form life cycle of Godzilla Ultima, and the King of the Monsters metamorphosis from Godzilla Amphibia to Godzilla Terrestris. But Shin Godzilla's biggest contribution to Singular Point was the high level of reality in its story's presentation. Director Takahashi, a self-admitted fan of Shin Godzilla, very much liked this idea, and it would eventually be applied to every part of Singular Point's narrative, from how the public would likely refer to a kaiju as a dinosaur upon first seeing one, to the depiction of how time would pass in the story itself. For example, to travel from Tokyo to Dubai, you have to take a plane. That requires travel time, and there is also a time difference. I wanted to depict such details without being vague, said Takahashi. This high level of reality, along with a science fiction approach and a puzzle-like mystery, would be the 3 key ingredients in helping Takahashi and EnJoe form the final story outline of Godzilla Singular Point. But still, what story to tell? They pondered more on Shin Godzilla, wondering if they should stay close to the events and ideas presented in that film, including accurately representing the government's response to a monster attack. But the director, Atsushi Takahashi, said, "Who can do that? There was no one on staff who was familiar with the political system," Toh EnJoe said to Kaiju.net. In the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook, EnJoe made similar remarks regarding a lack of anyone on staff knowing how the government worked, adding, "Technical topics are very delicate after all." Had the Godzilla anime production even had access to a political expert, EnJoe conceded to Bunga Kokai magazine that had they gone this route, there is no way to surpass Shin Godzilla. He also addressed how the huge number of characters that made up Shin Godzilla's cast would make the scenario impossible for a project like this. Due to budget constraints, the number of characters that could be created was limited, and there was no room to increase the number of characters on the government side.
Capitalizing on the success of Shin Godzilla seems like an obvious move for Toho to make going into the production of Godzilla Singular Point, but it is kind of perilous because if you don't have the same people involved, something like getting Kara on board, then you might wind up in a situation where what you come across is derivative and sort of a knockoff.
I'm not really a fan of that idea because I feel like we'd just be retreading the same thing that Shin Godzilla already did. There was also another anime called Japan Sinks, which came out in 2020 on Netflix, which actually covered a natural disaster in Japan, supposedly in a realistic manner. I haven't seen it myself, but because of the similarities with that and the fact it was also going to Netflix, that might be why they ended up dropping the idea.
I think it's funny because I thought of Shin Godzilla as I watched Singular Point, because to me it does still have a lot of government involvement, even though it's not like Hideki Anno's commentary on the government's ineptitude in Shin Godzilla. You know, there is still a lot of involvement from the government in Singular Point, and Godzilla is also, for lack of a better word, kind of weird and non-traditional.
One of the strengths of the Godzilla franchise has always been mixing things up and doing something different than has previously been done. And from that perspective, I think it was a good move to take Singular Point in a very different direction than Shin Godzilla, while still maintaining the kind of very well thought out scripting and aspirations of making Godzilla something loftier that Shin Godzilla really popularized.
And then there was also the matter of differentiating this new Godzilla anime from the rest of the Reiwa Godzilla entries. Even though Shin Godzilla was a hit, we wanted to pursue newness. We couldn't create the same kind of setting, director Takahashi explained to Asahi.com. It was also necessary to differentiate the series from the Godzilla anime trilogy produced by Polygon Pictures. This is why Takahashi and EnJoe opted to set their story in the near future of 2030. Pretty close to the modern times of Shin Godzilla, which they wanted to stick closely to, and about 20,000 years too early for the apocalyptic futurescape of the Godzilla anime trilogy. The show would take 2 years to make, so if we set it in present times, it would be outdated by the time it aired. Takahashi was quoted as saying to Anime Times, and we wouldn't know what would happen 100 years from now, so we thought 10 years from now would be good. Finally, the Godzilla anime had its setting, but again, what story to tell? By mid-2018, they finally found it. Director Takahashi had finally come up with the earliest form of Godzilla Singular Point's story, a rough idea that he soon presented to EnJoe. I wanted people from many different places to gather pieces of a puzzle, and that Godzilla had to be defeated once all the pieces had been gathered. This plotline would feature 7 or 8 characters, each holding a piece of the overarching plot's puzzle, and as the show progressed, the mysteries of the story would gradually be solved as the characters exchanged their puzzle pieces with one another. The story would also feature the characters having a number of near misses, missing each other by that much and never actually meeting face to face in the story, something that sounds very much like Pulp Fiction, one of Takahashi's initial creative influences. This idea carried on into the final version of Singular Point, where the show's protagonists, Mei and Yoon, almost meet each other in the first few episodes, but don't actually do so until the final minutes of the show's end. But as we were doing it, it proved to be difficult in practice to have all of these protagonists, Toh EnJoe said on the Episode 1 Blu-ray commentary. So we went with the double protagonists. I still think it would have been easier to do as an omnibus at the end of the day, Takahashi replied.
Omnibus-style storytelling there are a couple of different ways to think about it. Most commonly, it's used for when you're adapting something like a light novel, which is sort of a form of video game, and you have multiple paths that your character can take. So what they would tend to do is they would tell one character's storyline and then tell another character's storyline. And sometimes this involves completely resetting the story at the beginning, and sometimes it just is telling one character's story all the way through and then telling another character's story all the way through, and you sort of see how they interact with each other.
I hyperlink cinema fits more in line with what I think Takahashi may have been talking about. So hyperlink cinema is like a loose reference to internet browsing, where one keeps clicking on links and they have a bunch of tabs open and keep going between them, something like that. Sometimes the characters start off together and then they separate, or they start out separate, but a story will keep jumping between the characters and playing with time, keeping each relatively separate until they eventually come together and all is revealed to the audience. We do see something like that in Singular Point with Yun and May, since they don't meet in person until the very end. And I do think they kept the idea of hyperlink cinema, but just kept it and simplified it.
Given that there is a tendency to play around with time travel concepts in Toh EnJoe's work, I do wonder what the thought process was there, whether they wanted to do something that tells a story and then completely resets. An example of this would be something like Erased, which is a series that has an anime version and a live action version on Netflix, where a character is a time travel and he basically resets things. An American analog would be The Butterfly Effect. Or if they wanted to do something sort of focusing on individual characters, telling a single story, but focusing on one character at a time and giving their individual narratives in the style of Pulp Fiction. I think that either way, Toh EnJoe would have done an interesting job with it, and there's an argument to be made that Singular Point might be viewed as a very small omnibus production, because you do have sort of multiple interlocking stories, but they are not done entirely Yun's story and then entirely May's story, and as one goes, you see how it interacted with the other.
In a 13-episode Godzilla series, I don't know that I see that working. I do like that type of storytelling because I feel like I saw it a little bit in Game of Thrones, where you have all these characters a lot of times that don't actually ever interact with each other, and then there's a huge payoff when these characters finally meet.
I think they would have had to have dragged the episodes out a lot more, so they might have had to go to 24 episodes instead of what we got, and that might have ended up being really tedious for an anime. I feel like it works much better in a movie format.
I would be willing to check this sort of format out, done with a Godzilla series. It's not necessarily my preferred format when it comes to animation. A lot of that is, again, due to usually it's adapting source material that isn't really my sort of jam. You know, if it's adapting like a dating simulator and it's about what if Hikaru-kun picks Minami-chan, what if Hikaru-kun picks Maruko-chan, and something like that, and then telling their whole story as though you're going down that route. So those types of stories don't interest me as much, but you can definitely do interesting things with that. But I think that the decisions that were made were probably for the best when it came to parsing that down for Singular Point.
While the omnibus narrative style perhaps would have been easier, as director Takahashi suggested, the overarching story wasn't quite decided yet, EnJoe reminded the director. We couldn't carve it up properly into an omnibus. It's at this point that the story of our little series, the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point, ends. But Godzilla Singular Point's story truly begins. Having finally hit upon the basic concept for the Godzilla anime, director Takahashi and series composer EnJoe, who would later become Singular Point's scriptwriter, would continue to draft, tinker, and design the narrative for another 2 years, from mid-2018 to July of 2020, when the story was at last finalized into the show we know today. At some point, maybe we'll visit that time period of Singular Point's history. The 2 years of drafts, rewrites, production deadlines, producer doubts, and more. That's another story for another video for another time. I very much hope you enjoyed the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. I need to thank Kevin Derendorf, John LeMay, Patrick Galvan, and Rainey for lending their expertise, as well as to all of my super chatters who donated generously over the past few months. A lot of time, money, and effort was put in by all involved in order to make this a reality, and it's something I'm truly grateful for. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.